Thank you very much, and thank you Faisal and Caroline for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to come, in fact, to my first NAPIQ conference. I've been asked to talk about an inquiry that I was a medical member on, which reported last year, and to share some thoughts and reflections, and that's been the title of my talk. Some of you might be aware of this. The inquiry got quite a lot of publicity because of the aspect of cannibalism, which actually formed a very small, almost negligible part of our inquiry. But of course, the media were enticed by that. What I aim to do is to describe a little bit about what it was like to be involved in the inquiry, some of the themes that came up from that, looking particularly at the perspective of risk and relapse indicators, and then to share some concluding reflections. For those that can't sleep, it is published in 2 volumes, which is now available on the NHS website, NHS London website. And in fact, there are 2 inquiry reports, because this patient, as I'll describe in a few minutes, was actually responsible for 2 homicides in quick succession, and there was a concurrent inquiry at Broadmoor Hospital that looked at the circumstances surrounding that homicide. Just to give a timeline to set this in some sort of context for you, the patient, his name is in the public domain, it's Peter Bryan, or PB as we referred to him throughout, was born in London in 1969, and he actually had killed a young woman who he felt was in a relationship with him, but all reports seem to indicate otherwise. Following that killing, he was sent to Rampton. He was there about 7.5 years, moved to medium security, only for 6 months, discharged by a tribunal, 2 years in the community. That came to an end when he killed an acquaintance of his, Brian Cherry. He was arrested, remanded in custody, sent to Broadmoor, and within a very few days there, fatally assaulted another patient. And so, in actual fact, he'd been responsible for 3 killings over an 11-year period. And the inquiry that I was involved in was the one looking at the second killing, and as I mentioned, there was a third killing, which was the subject of the other inquiry. So the timeline for our inquiry, well, the inquiry can't start until all the criminal proceedings have been concluded, in case there are outstanding questions about responsibility. So the inquiry itself was established in July 2005. The barrister was appointed to chair the committee, and then the members were appointed shortly afterwards. We began witness hearings in November. They continued for some 18 months, and then the report itself took about a year to write. NHS London, much to our annoyance, spent, well, I think longer than we took to write it, to read it. And during that time, they passed through, rather hastily, I think, a policy of making everyone in the inquiry report anonymous, and that was done shortly before the report was published, just over a year ago. The terms of reference are fairly standard nowadays in these inquiries after homicide. It's, in essence, to look at the circumstances surrounding the care and treatment of that patient. And the first term of inquiry there, terms of reference, sorry, for the inquiry, sets the timeline for us, which was from discharge planning in Rampton to admission to Broadmoor, over 2 years. We felt that if you're going to consider the discharge planning and whether that's appropriate, you need to look at the treatment that went before that, and in essence, we looked at his whole admission to Rampton. And it was some pride that we were able to report within the same time period as the second inquiry that was examining a period of just over 2 weeks, when we've considered a number of years. The second term of reference makes particular reference to risk, which I'll return to. There's always something about communication, liaison between agencies, so that's there as number 3. And then there's the publication of the report, which I've mentioned. This is actually a condensed version of the terms of reference. To the tabloid papers, there was really only one question that needed to be answered. And so their terms of reference was put in the form of a rather pithy question. As I say, that aspect seemed to entice them. It really played very little part in our inquiry. And so I'm sure that's not why I was not put on after lunch. Just to give some background about the legal basis, these inquiries have been mandatory since 1994, and if you remember, Peter Bryan had been responsible for killing a young woman in 1993, so his first homicide had actually taken place just shortly before these health service guidelines came out in 94. Which themselves were a product of an internal review in the Department of Health about perceived failings in community care at that time. But Health Service Guidelines 94/27 established a mandatory footing for them. Since then, a greater focus on human rights has brought that aspect into play, and Article 2, which is the right to life, establishes not only positive obligations on the state, but also a procedural obligation that if there has been a death, then that has to be the subject of an effective official investigation, and that's so with deaths in custody as well as in the community. Membership of the panel. Usually panels of inquiry about 3 members. We had 4. We added a nurse because of the need to look at the nursing side in some considerable detail. But fairly standard other than the number. A barrister chairs the inquiry. We had a social worker, myself, and a medical member. I'm a forensic psychiatrist. There was going to be some examination of general psychiatric issues, and so we had the services of a professor of general psychiatry for certain aspects. And then we had a management to look over the running and coordination of the inquiry. I'm often asked how you get chosen to be on the inquiry, and I think there are 3 main requirements. First is independence. You have to be independent of the trust, obviously. It is an official external inquiry. Secondly, it's necessary to have a degree of seniority within the profession. In effect, you're providing an expert opinion or commentary, and so you need a degree of experience to substantiate that opinion. And then thirdly, and perhaps importantly, it's knowing the right people. And this is the 3rd inquiry that I've done, and it's all been recommendations from people you've known or come across, and you then get invited to join another inquiry. Some procedural comments to make first before looking at the practicalities. These inquiries are not trials. The criminal responsibility has been apportioned in the criminal proceedings, and the person who was responsible was convicted of the homicide. They're also not there to make judgments on clinical competence in a judicial sense, although it has to be borne in mind that some of the findings could be taken up in subsequent professional proceedings. But really the aims of an inquiry is to look into the care and treatment of that one particular patient with the aim of making recommendations about better and safer practice in the future. And of course there's some question as to how valid is it to take one isolated case study and make generalized comments, and that might be something we can discuss later. Another question that I'm asked is, what's the standard against which people are judged? And it's not best practice. You don't have to be the best psychiatrist, nurse, or whatever in the country. It's simply good practice as judged against local policies, national guidance, statute, professional codes of practice, conduct, etc. And then the third question is, of course, well, you can't get away from hindsight bias. This is the phenomenon that you're more inclined to look at events that you know have subsequently occurred, in this case the death of someone else, and to interpret events that led up to that as in effect confirming that there was a degree of inevitability about it. And of course that is an issue. I think it's been shown that examining possible alternatives does help to reduce the effects of hindsight bias, but we were very conscious that when we were making comments or criticisms that we had to take into account what was known by the team at that point in time. What happened the next day or the next week or month was irrelevant because they didn't know it. They were making decisions in real time with a plethora of information coming forward just on one patient, never mind all the others that they were dealing with. And it was important to recognise that things are never quite so clear when you're going forward as they are when you look back. There was a little bit of reading to do. This is my collection of the notes that we were sent. I did it as a sort of masochistic venture just to prove to myself how much we did actually read. It was estimated there were about 10,000 pages of records. Sorry, that's the one you should be looking at. I put it all together and photographed it before sending it back for shredding. 10,000 pages, reports, statements into 2 homicides, daily records for about 8 years of inpatient care, 2 years of outpatient care follow-up in the community. Then there were also the transcripts from all the interviews, and some of those ran to 50 or 60 pages. And then finally drafts and redrafts of the inquiry. The witness hearings went on over an 18-month period, and we saw 64 witnesses, 5 for a second time for follow-up questions. And I estimated there was about 180 hours of evidence from the witness hearings alone. The witnesses are invited to attend. It's not compulsory, they don't have to come. We had difficulty tracking some down, but none refused to attend. Many of them had prepared statements beforehand and attended with their solicitor or some representative from their professional body for support. The hearings were conducted in a relatively informal setting. They were recorded for the purposes of transcription, but it wasn't a cross-examination, and we didn't have any problems about people being reticent to talk to us. One of the comments that NHS London made in favour of making the report anonymous was that witnesses might not be willing to come forward. We didn't find that that was a case. In fact, the person who came in for most criticism was really quite voluble, and we sat late one evening listening to his account. After the hearing, they sent a transcript of their evidence in case what they said wasn't quite what they meant, it didn't come out quite right, and they were encouraged to correct that or add things if they wanted to make sure that their account was true. And then they were also sent a draft copy of the report if they were going to be mentioned in any way, whether it was positive or negative. And so there were attempts to make sure that, again, it reflected what they felt their experience had been, rather than just making comments on what we thought had taken place. And as I mentioned, the report was published just over a year ago. There are many themes that could be looked at from inquiries like this. As I mentioned, we spent a number of months, countless meetings, debating, discussing, poring over the evidence. I'm going to concentrate on the last comment there on relapse and risk, but just wanted to mention a couple of others just in passing, really. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Peter Bryan was a restricted patient. He'd got a restricted hospital order by virtue of his conviction for the manslaughter of the young girl in 1993. But that history of serious violence seemed to go missing over the years. He was described as a model patient in Rampton. And I think we had some debate about this dichotomy between care and control. If I want to make a general comment, and I recognise the limitations of general comments, but it would be that general psychiatrists would favour a more caring model, whereas forensic psychiatrists would be more willing to adopt a control model. The reporting requirements of the supervisors to the Ministry of Justice weren't fully understood, and sometimes their reports were in conflict with one another, and they often didn't keep the Home Office informed. We had a member of the Home Office come to us and detail the 17 letters that they sent to the consultant asking for reports, and I think over the 2 years that the patient was in the community, they only got one report when they should have had one every 3 months. There were a number of issues around the tribunal process. The consultant at the medium secure unit didn't attend any of the tribunals. He didn't supervise his senior trainee, who was asked to attend a legally difficult tribunal as her first experience of the tribunal system. And there was also question marks over the team's opinion being represented to the tribunal, and some debate as to how much they felt that they could go against what seemed to be an inevitable discharge. And then the threshold and the mechanics about recalling a patient who's on a conditional discharge in the community back into hospital didn't seem to be fully understood. He was often threatened with being formally recalled, but it never happened. And in fact, when he did get admitted shortly before the homicide that we investigated, he was admitted as an informal patient for his own protection. It was felt that he was at some risk from others in the community, rather than, as we saw it, representing a very severe risk to other people, including a young girl that he'd committed a sexual assault against, although that was never investigated. The Clunis inquiry was one of the first in, if you like, the modern era. It's become rather iconic in the world of homicide inquiries. And it made this comment about communication. And I suppose that this has been repeated in virtually all the inquiries ever since, and it was certainly true in our inquiry. And there were lapses in communication at the crucial pivotal points in this patient's clinical pathway. So the move from high secure to medium secure, in many respects, was really quite good, and there was good handover of information, but not entirely. The patient actually went on trial leave, and that didn't seem to get formally concluded. The handover from the forensic to the general service after the patient had been in the community for 6 months, I'll come on to, was really quite shambolic in many ways. And then when the patient was admitted as an informal patient to a mixed, and as I've said, this was following a sexual assault, he was admitted to a mixed ward, the transfer of information was confused. Within the team, and particularly the community team, there were difficulties. We made the comment that it was a virtual team. They never met as three to consider the patient. At any meeting, it was never more than two. The two supervisors who had formal responsibilities to report to the Home Office, now the Ministry of Justice, had less forensic experience in dealing with a restricted patient than the community forensic nurse, who was professionally isolated both from the general team and also from the forensic service. And then, as I've said, the reporting beyond the clinical team to the Ministry of Justice was haphazard and erratic. So for the final 10 minutes or so, I just wanted to look at the issue of relapse and risk, looking at assessment of risk really from the point of view of examining early warning signs of relapse, the so-called relapse signature. It's a narrow perspective, I admit that. I'm not claiming that it gives the full picture, but for the sake of time, I'm going to limit my comments to this and hope that the wider message is understood. The risk of violence in Peter Bryan was linked to his mental illness. There was some debate as to what his illness was. It was understood that he suffered from schizophrenia, but the role of personality and personality disorder was really only I think, properly understood once he arrived in Broadmoor, and he's since attracted a dual classification of mental illness and personality disorder. Consideration of risk was part of our terms of reference, and so it's right and proper that that should be looked at. And as I've mentioned, he was a restricted patient, and part of the criteria for getting a restriction order is because of it's necessary for the protection of the public from serious harm. So it's there very much as a community option when the person reaches a conditional discharge, in giving a degree of control to those supervising the person in the community. What I'm going to do is to look at what was considered about the patient's relapse indicators at various stages through his time in hospital. First of all, in Rampton, and there he was there for 7 years, and really a considerable amount of work was done with Peter Bryan. And one of the very good reports was prepared by the psychologist, who considered that he had two offence patterns. One was the index offence, that was the homicide of the young girl, but before that he'd been a rather streetwise adolescent who was not averse to mugging people for their money, their mobile phones, dealing in drugs, etc. And it was noted that there was an extensive use of instrumental violence to elicit money. They didn't really see that in Rampton. What they saw was someone who rather liked to get one over on the staff. There was a notorious episode when he tried to get away with drinking some homemade alcohol that he'd brewed in his room while playing pool, and got discovered by the staff. But that was typical of him, that he would sort of test himself against the staff, see if the staff were up to dealing with him. And I think that one could see that in the community, that often the staff weren't up to dealing with him, and he would push the boundaries increasingly so. It was considered that risk was triggered by a number of factors, not just mental illness and drugs. And it was said that he had a high risk of resuming his criminal lifestyle of muggings and robbery, and a moderate risk of reoffending in a similar way to the index offence. And they recommended that further work needed to be done on the offence cycle, relapse prevention, but also looking at substance misuse. In the medium secure unit, there was an extremely good psychology report, and one of the reasons we were annoyed, disappointed that the report anonymised all the staff was that people such as the author of this report couldn't be publicly identified for the excellent work that we felt that they had done. This assessment considered Peter Bryan's functioning across several domains, not just his mental state, but also personality and cognitive styles. I'm going to make particular mention of his relationships with women, because it was concluded that there was a generic risk of violence to women, not just to Asian women. His first victim had been a young Asian girl, but that wasn't seen as significant that she was Asian rather than any other ethnic group. And I mention that because this focus on his relationships will become apparent in a distorted form later on. So that was the psychology report, and from that the psychologist generated a relapse signature, which I've summarised here. And you see that it's really quite a sophisticated signature. A number of features are described in some detail there. The psychologist also noted that it would be possible for subtle signs of breakdown in his mental health to be mistakenly attributed to personality features rather than to a relapse. And again, that was a comment that came back to haunt other people later on. The psychologist also made a valid point that a lot of the psychology work had taken the form of assessments rather than intervention. Lots of people were coming along to assess what he was like at a particular point in time, but in terms of following up on that work and dealing with it, there seemed to be very little ongoing work. Now I'm going to put up the relapse indicators as they were identified at a CPA meeting in January 2002. And this psychology report had been written for that meeting. And from the minutes of that final CPA meeting, they'd identified 3 relapse indicators, and you'll see that already we've lost some of the sophistication of the psychologist's report. The social inappropriateness or sexually disinhibited behaviour has now become transformed into infatuation with women in a general sense. So that was the final CPA meeting, which took place in January 2002. Shortly after that, there was a tribunal at which the conditional discharge was confirmed, and so there was a need for a Section 117 meeting before Peter Bryan left hospital. And that meeting took place 1 month later. So there is a 1 month period between these relapse indicators and these, which were noted. And you'll see, if we look at the infatuation, especially with Asian girls, has become noted. And that's a rather gross assumption based on the ethnic origin of his first victim. But as I hope I've demonstrated, it wasn't really borne out by the detailed assessments that had taken place. So Peter Bryan was then discharged into the community. He was looked after by the forensic psychiatrist from the medium secure unit for a 6-month period before being handed over to a general psychiatrist who'd had no experience in looking after restricted patients. He told us he'd never looked after a patient who'd killed someone else before, but he felt he had no option because this person lived in his catchment area, and so he had to take him on. The psychiatrist came across as a very hard-working, well-meaning person who was really very much out of his depth. There was a handover CPA meeting in September 2002. The general psychiatrist couldn't attend. He sent a deputy along. The forensic psychiatrist turned up late, so late that he missed seeing the patient. The patient was annoyed because his consultants weren't around. But this was the handover meeting which the forensic team was going to hand over to the general team. So obviously the general team would be interested to know what to look out for in case there was a relapse. They were told that the relapse indicators were paranoia and suspiciousness, drug use, and increasing irritability and hostility. These aren't the same as the ones that he went out with 6 months previously. They'd been changed again. Gone is the mention of increasing social inappropriateness or sexually disinhibited behaviour. So we're now some distance away from the psychology assessment that took place in the medium secure unit. They give really very little indication of the subtle changes that could take place if Peter Bryan was going to relapse. And in fact, there was really quite good evidence that I won't go through now for lack of time, that those subtle indications cropped up time and time again throughout his time in the community. One of our recommendations was that a CPA document needed to be prepared at every transition point, even if it doesn't involve transition from hospital to community, but from team to team. And I've written out there the guidance from the Ministry of Justice documents for restricted patients, but one could broaden that to all patients. We asked the general psychiatrist what his recollection of the handover of risk information was, and this is his quotation. He said, "We were told to look out for if he became infatuated with a young Asian woman and became very obviously psychotic." Well, there are 2 comments in particular. One was that Asian girls hadn't been mentioned in the handover meeting, so we're not quite sure how that cropped up again. And also he was looking for gross signs of relapse rather than the subtle signs of deterioration that the psychologist had pointed out. So we can make some general points from the inquiry. The important risk information was not included in risk assessments, and the focus was restricted to relatively conspicuous relapse indicators. A lot of very good work had been done at Rampton and in medium security by the psychologist, detailing a very sophisticated, subtle picture of relapse signs, and that was completely lost. Signs of relapse were identified by staff, but these were invariably dismissed as features of the patient's personality. There was relatively little discussion about Peter Bryan amongst the clinical team. And there would seem to be a pattern that staff, and the staff at the hostel were all, the senior staff were experienced mental health workers, that they would raise concerns, they would be taken to the team, emergency meeting would be convened, and invariably those concerns were dismissed as being, well, Peter's just being Peter, or that's the way he is, that's his personality. So those concerns were often left unresolved or dismissed and then were overtaken by further events. I mentioned the psychiatric and social supervisors who have statutory responsibilities to report to the Ministry of Justice were both inexperienced, certainly with complex forensic patients. In fact, the social worker, it turned out, had got no mental health experience prior to taking on this patient. He didn't see that as a problem, and he thought that he did a good job. And in fact, colleagues thought that he was doing a reasonable job as well. There was a tendency to normalise behaviour and see it as distinct from relapse or the risk of offending. As I mentioned, the CPN was most experienced, but he was professionally isolated, and his comments often fell on deaf ears. And this comes back to this notion of care versus control, and we had some debates as to, well, you can't resolve it, but you need a balance, I think, between care and control if you're going to successfully look after such patients in the community, be alive to the possibility of relapse at the same time trying to promote recovery. So, just to conclude with some thoughts about relapse and risk. A systematic assessment of risk, I'd say, and this is based very much on the HCR20 model, but it involves past history, which requires an in-depth understanding of the patient to bring out the subtleties of relapse. You need to have an understanding of their present state and also an eye on future stressors. It also requires a lexicon of risk so that risk can be properly described, formulated and then communicated to other people, other teams in particular. Risk and relapse are multifaceted. They involve internal factors, not just mental state, about the person's mental illness, but also about personality. And I'm not talking about personality disorder necessarily, but personality traits and understanding of how the person would normally react in given situations. External factors are the situational factors that would become relevant, whether it's accommodation or the frequency and intensity of community supervision and support. And illicit drugs are also important. The assessment should inform the team's areas of concern, which then have to become the focus of management. Risk assessment can't or shouldn't exist in isolation from risk management. And the early warning signs of relapse must lead to a contingency plan, which part of that has to be when to intervene. When does the patient cross a line? When is it too much and they need to be seen, and those factors need to be discussed? And Tony Maiden, who's done a review of homicide inquiries, looking at it from the perspective of doing the HCR20 risk assessments, makes the very valid point that if you don't set limits, then there is no point at which you have to have a conversation with the patient, and that very conversation might be something that elicits more information. He uses the example of illicit drug use. If you don't have a discussion with them about drug use, how will you know what their attitude to the drugs is, their attitude to their illness more generally, their lifestyle, their future aspirations, etc. And I'm often here myself in tribunals talking about internal and external controls. It's more obvious in an inpatient setting where you have the physical security, procedural security, providing some external control to compensate for a person's lack of internal control. But I do believe that in the community one can recreate that external framework to some extent through arrangements such as supervision, but also the legal framework such as community treatment orders or conditional discharge in this case. So finally, on to reflections. I think it's important to remember that the standard being sought is not best practice, but good practice. The social worker on the panel observed that even if you knew nothing about assessing risk, provided you provided a good standard of care and treatment for the mental illness, then you should be home in the majority of cases, that by treating the symptoms, you're reducing the risk as a consequence. Defendable practice demands the ability to reconstruct decision-making at points, months, or probably years after the event. So setting down your action plan, following it, and recording reasons for any departure or subsequent developments provides a large degree of immunity from future criticism. If things do go wrong, if there's an adverse outcome, but it's being preceded by good planning, clear communication, and proper recording, then you're far more likely to attract sympathy rather than censure from the inquiry team. And that was so in our inquiry on a number of occasions. And finally, I chose this image of a reflection, partly because the figure seems to be has something the look of a psychiatrist about him, but also because the holder of the crystal ball is himself reflected. And certainly I find that when I read inquiry reports, and I've read a number of them, one can see some aspects of one's own practice and management reflected in the findings. And I think that should urge us to constantly monitor and reflect on our own work to seek to improve the treatment that we offer. And by doing so and constantly reviewing ourselves, perhaps through the adverse experiences of others, then we should improve the care that we offer to others. Thank you very much.